Everyone, I'm Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute, and it's an enormous pleasure to host the Commonwealth War Graves Commission here today for a discussion that hardly needs any introduction from me about commemorating the past and the trends of the present. Now, in the half day that we have today, we will hear from a number of people, including the Minister, Baroness Goldie, here in front of us. And we will then have a keynote speech by Sir Hugh Strawn, followed by a panel discussion ably chaired by Mark Urban, and then an address from the Australian Minister, Matt Keogh, on the subject. And I do hope that we will all take part and contribute to the discussion. Let me turn over to Admiral Hudson.
Well, Your Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, guests, it gives me great pleasure as the Vice Chairman of the Commission to welcome you to Russie in this wonderfully renovated and restored headquarters, to have this joint conference between the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and Russie to explore the issue of remembrance and commemoration and how the two themes relate together. It's particularly pleasing to welcome our international guests, including those who've traveled from far, from Australia, from Canada, and of course, across Europe. Thank you very much for making the effort. And of course, events like this don't happen out of thin air. It requires a lot of work by Jonathan's team here at the Institute, and of course, the Director General Claire's team at the Commission. So thank you very much to all of those who've put a huge amount of effort into making it happen. So today's event will explore, hopefully, the significance of commemoration, the role it could play now and in the future, including perhaps as an instrument of international diplomacy. So perhaps I can set the scene and just throw in a few questions. Now, the Commission, our mission, as enshrined in our founding charter of over 100 years ago, is to ensure that those who died in service in the two world wars or because of conflict are suitably commemorated so that their sacrifice is never forgotten. We fulfill this task in over 150 countries and strive to ensure that the details, the deaths of over 1.75 million people do not slip into the mists of time. We firmly believe that remembering individuals who've died in those conflicts is of universal, perpetual relevance, and that reflecting on their deaths is of continuing and paramount importance to us all. Our own work highlights the two central tenets of commemoration. Firstly, the scale, the supreme endeavor, the national suffering, and the profound consequences of global campaigns for each of the nations involved, be they victor or vanquished. In so many areas, from Gallipoli through to the Somme, into North Africa, the scale or intensity of sacrifice helps shape a national identity. It accentuates character and is, of course, a very focused commemoration and active national recognition. And alongside that, secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is also the intimate, the personal impact upon families caused by the untimely death of their loved ones, the enduring nature of loss, and individual tragedy. Our debate might focus on the former, but it must meld the primary essence of our work, which is to ensure that the person, the individual, wherever they fell, are not forgotten. Today, as always, it's the individual that people are drawn towards, those individual stories. Education of the consequence of war amongst the young invariably starts with the story of sacrifice or tragedy, perhaps in their own locality. This afternoon at 2:30 in Passchendaele New Cemetery, we will lay to rest Rifleman Frederick Adams of the 2nd Battalion of the Rifles, who was 26 when he died in battle in 1917. We buried 2 unknown British soldiers yesterday. So commemoration is certainly not static. It's an ongoing mission. It evolves, but in what direction? How do you maintain connectivity with the citizens of today? Equally, one can only wonder at the disappointment that would be felt by our founder, Sir Fabian Ware, who in the last surviving recording, and we have them, of his annual armistice addresses, given some weeks after the conclusion of the Munich crisis, remarked that he personally informed Mussolini that common remembrance of the dead, of the Great War, is the one thing, sometimes the only thing, that brings our peoples together. His dreams, and of those many we commemorate, that the Great War was the war to end all wars, and the Commission's work of commemoration and memorization would enable that vision, clearly failed. For it is indeed a fundamental right of any state power, democratic states, whatever, to choose in the right circumstances and with the right cause to engage in what they call today operations, but to engage in war. It always has been. So perhaps these idealistic views were somewhat naive. We in our community, I suppose, shape consequence, not the initial engagement. Can we realistically influence decision makers and governments as they grapple with global challenges? And what relevance will commemoration have for future generations? Will this commission still be trimming grass, deadheading roses across the world in 1,000 years' time? And if so, why? How will they change? Should they change? In 1920, Churchill said this in the House of Commons: "The stone of remembrance is part of the effort of the Commission to secure a permanent memorial. These great stones of Portland stone, weighing about 10 tons, with a common inscription, 'Their name liveth forevermore,' these stones will certainly be in existence in 2,000 and 3,000 years' time. These great stones will preserve the memory of a common purpose, pursued by a great nation in the remote past, and will undoubtedly excite the wonder and the reverence of the future ages." Was he right? So King George V, as we know, on his battlefield tour in 1920 said, "I've many times asked myself whether there can be more potent advocates of peace upon the earth through the years to come than this massed multitude of silent witnesses to the desolation of war." Tragedy continues and continues to befall nations. Our debate today takes place against the backdrop of war in Ukraine, conflict in Gaza, tension in the Far East. And we in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission are not immune to such pressures. And I would ask you all to spare a thought for our commission staff, our teams, particularly in Israel and Gaza, who are still deeply affected by current events. So those are a few thoughts, a few questions. So I look forward to a lively debate and to exploring your contributions and thoughts more widely as together we seek to create a strong commemorative future, one that's inclusive, one that's relevant, and of course one that is valued. So perhaps I could welcome Baroness Goldie, a Minister of State in the Ministry of Defence, to the lectern to kickstart our discussions. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. Let me say it's not just a huge pleasure to be with you all today, because I'm pleased to say that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission I regard as a friend. We're not strangers to each other, and I'm always immensely chuffed, as we say in Scotland, when I'm invited to be at one of your events. But it's a huge privilege to be here with you today, and given the close proximity of Remembrance Day, perhaps especially appropriate. But I want to begin by paying tribute to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for the immense work it does on our nation's behalf, and on behalf of the millions of families who remember lost relatives. Whenever I see an approaching man with glasses, I get slightly worried. Thanks, Nige. I was just going to say that I want to pay tribute to the Commission for the immense work it does on our nation's behalf, but also on behalf of the millions of families who remember lost relatives lying at peace somewhere in a Commonwealth war grave. And for over a century, you have stuck faithfully to Churchill's dictum, which is, the thing that is deeply ingrained in soldierly breasts is that all should be treated alike, general and private, prince and peasant, all who lie there in common honour. Now, maintaining cemeteries, memorials, graves, landscapes, and records across a staggering 23,000 locations in 153 countries is a truly Herculean labour. And yet it is a burden you bear steadfastly and with devotion, undertaking your duties with the quiet dignity and deference due to all those who have fallen in service of our country. And you know that these beautiful, peaceful resting places are legacies for the living as well as for the fallen. And that from the smallest blade of grass to the greatest sentinels of oaks, each is a link in the filigree chain of commemoration. And anyone who has visited Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery from Arras to Alamein, from Cambrai to Chittagong, or for me, memorably Kranji in Singapore, cannot fail to be moved by their sombre solemnity, but also their tranquility, places of peace, of quiet and reflection. Inevitably calling to mind John McCrae's immortal lines, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row." Yet beyond this family, this familial circle of the Commission, I think too few know of your great endeavours, working in every continent to deliver premier standards of care across our cemeteries and memorials. So in days like today, we take the opportunity to say to you a heartfelt thank you. It's perhaps a common misconception that the work of the Commission somehow operates almost robotically, dictated by the cycle of the seasons. Spring turns to summer, autumn turns to winter. But actually, your gardeners carry on regardless, doing what they always do and doing it so professionally and so effectively, unfazed by the seasons. And your gardeners are in the front line in the fight against climate change. In Northern Europe, seasons are blurring. Extreme weather records are being broken year on year. Excessive heat, extreme cold, drought, torrential rain, they are all taking their toll. Plant species, once thought to be hardy and enduring, are failing. Well-established varieties of species are declining. And what is so impressive to me is the way within the Commission you have taken this incredibly escalating challenge, but you've turned it to your advantage, because your gardeners understand their role as custodians of the landscape better than anyone else. And they've started trialing new approaches to maintenance, to grassland development, to mowing cycles. They've been minimizing the use of chemical products, monitoring how and when to use water for irrigation in North Africa and the Mediterranean, mining global data to decide when and where to plant trees and to determine which species will be at risk due to these changing weather patterns. And making the most of their expertise, they've created new havens of biodiversity, new habitats for a myriad of species. So CWGC has actually become a pioneer with environmental sustainability woven into its DNA, along with its partners, including the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, English Heritage, the National Trust, and the Royal Horticultural Society. And it's transformed itself into a major and authoritative player in conservation. But I suspect, we're still just at the dawn of this new horticultural age. And just as nothing stands still in the natural world, so must we bend our thoughts to the future. CWCG strategy couldn't have been clearer. It's about delivering environmentally sustainable, cost-effective, biodiverse, and location-appropriate world-class horticulture that delights, that inspires, and informs. And that is a remarkable strategy and one worthy of support. And as we mark another Remembrance Day, our challenge, I think, is to refresh our thinking once more, to consider whether there is more to do, more we might improve. Is there more ambition left to fulfill? Well, I see a hybrid future. I see a hybrid future encompassing education, engagement with governments, engagement with academia, engagement with research institutes like RUSI. And I know that you will do that and undertake that challenge with a passion. In a world scarred by wars and divisions, One of the greatest gifts we have to bestow on the next generation are these tranquil gardens of peace and reconciliation. Come rain or shine, we must do everything in our power to make sure they continue as places of physical beauty, reflecting the best in nature and diversity, an enduring legacy for those who come to remember. So in conclusion, may I say that in all of that, I wish you well, and I thank you for your passion and your commitment. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce someone who is an old friend of yours, Sir Hugh Strawn, someone from whom I think you really do want to hear. Thank you very much.
Baroness Goldie, thank you. I hope you're right. I sometimes wonder whether you are. You've probably heard too much from me on this sort of subject. It's actually very reassuring to be in this building. It shows that the RUSI has the same values as the Commission. You can do a lot of work to the building, but it still looks exactly the same. 9 years ago, almost, on the 11th of November, 1914, the French did something slightly different. They unveiled a new First World War memorial in the Pas de Calais. Northern France, of course, as you all know, is not short of war memorials. And the site of the new memorial, Notre-Dame de Lorette, is the largest French military cemetery in northern France. It overlooks the battlefields of Artois in a panoramic sweep that runs from Luce in the north to Arras in the south. But the new memorial, L'Anneau de la Mémoire, the Ring of Memory, is different from the others. It is a statement of reconciliation, and of course all memorials and cemeteries in some ways are that, but it also specifically commemorates all those killed and known to be buried in northern France in the First World War, regardless of nationality or of side. It contains almost 600,000 names from 40 different countries. Almost 250,000 of those names hail from the forces of the former British Empire. That is distinctly odd. It is odd because most British visitors don't notice that point, and it is odd because France's total dead in the First World War were roughly 50% higher than Britain's, and Germany's roughly 100% higher. The French army suffered horrendous casualties in Artois, especially in 1915, and the Germans held that front single-handedly for the duration of the war. Yet the French dead commemorated at the memorial numbered just over 100,000, and the Germans just over 174,000. The fact that the British dead could be named and identified so readily and so disproportionately is due to the work of, and you've already heard his name, Fabian Ware, who was earlier, September 1914, set up a Red Cross mobile unit which began the work of registering British graves. In March 1915, Ware's unit was recognized as the Graves Registration Commission. And at the end of 1917, it was accorded a royal charter as the Imperial War Graves Commission. Britain and its empire are overrepresented in the L'Anneau de la Mémoire because Britain was first off the mark. It is also overrepresented because in April 1915, the then Adjutant General prohibited the repatriation of bodies, ostensibly in the interests of hygiene. During the war, the French and Germans returned many bodies to their families for burial. Many in Britain assumed that the ban on repatriation would be lifted when the war was over. It was not. The challenges of returning bodies to Australia and New Zealand, not just the United Kingdom, the divisiveness of doing so when some families could meet the costs and others could not, these were powerful influences in preventing the revocation of the ban on repatriation. The grieving families, the bereft mothers and fathers, were told that those who died should lie together, and that collective identity should prevail over the dead soldier's individual identity. The Commission and the government defended the decision on the basis of what the Commission continues to call the Kenyan principles. At its first official meeting in November 1917, the Imperial War Graves Commission appointed Sir Frederick Kenyon, the director of the British Museum, as its advisor. And in February 1918, with extraordinary rapidity, in other words, it accepted the guidelines which he proposed and which still apply, broadly speaking, to this day, embracing, of course, the Second World War as well as the First. The first of those principles, and the one underpinning the refusal to repatriate, was the principle of equality in death, regardless of social standing, of race or religion. The wisdom of that principle is no longer called into question. But in 1918 and 1919, the shadow of the Russian Revolution and the fear of Bolshevism spread across Europe from east to west and here to London. The Commission's ideas were savaged as collectivist and incipiently socialist, as the rules of an overpowerful state generated by war itself and acting in the name of nation and empire, but a state which was disregarding the principles of individualism which undergirded Victorian liberalism and Britain's sense of what it was fighting for when it took on Prussia in 1914. The Commission also upset the established churches. The Kenyan principles stated that there should be uniform designs for the gravestones and common features in the cemeteries, and that they should be sites for all faiths and accommodate those with none. For many, there was an element of paganism in the work of memorialization. Those crowds, sorry, can't read my own writing as usual. The structures were statements of belief less in an individual's afterlife than in an enduring empire. This became particularly evident in the memorials to the missing. Given that about half of those killed, 1.7 million, that the Commission commemorates, have no known grave, the Commission from the first had to find ways other than graves and cemeteries to commemorate them. The archetypes for Blomfield's Menin Gate or Lutyens' Thiepval Arch were classically Greek, Roman, and not Christian or Anglican. The most striking example of all is perhaps just a few hundred yards away in Whitehall, Lutyens' cenotaph. Today, there is today it is essentially those constructions, those memorials to the missing, not the churches, which draw in the crowds on Remembrance Sunday. And those crowds capture a form of spirituality and religiosity, but is one which continues to have a secular stamp and can make some clerics uneasy. But at least here in the United Kingdom, as Baroness Goldley has already reflected, commemoration is unifying more than it is divisive, tolerant more than it is toxic. Today, we forget just how radical and innovatory the Commission was. Its decisions have now become hallowed by habit. They have reshaped the battlefields of France in a built landscape with horticultural designs which would have made them unrecognizable to those who died there. But it is those that today are the central features of any battlefield tour. By the time I had the privilege to become a commissioner in 2006, and I remain one way past my sell-by date until 2018, the obligations of the Kenyan principles, represented by its high horticultural standards and the care and quality of its masonry, were set in stone as solid as the Portland of so many of its memorials. I'm struck by the fact that the strategy document, which you can pick up if you are here in the building, available from today's Commission, describes itself as a strategy towards 2039, the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War. As late as 2011, the Commission's only strategy for the centenary of the First World War was to have the buildings and gardens in tip-top condition. When Lawrence Binion, another British Museum employee, wrote for the fallen after the Battle of Mons on the 23rd of August 1914, British total casualties had reached about 1,600. He told us, without any awareness of what was yet to come, that at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We solemnly reply on Remembrance Sunday that we shall, although none of us actually knew any of those killed in the First World War, and very few of us are still alive who knew anybody killed in the Second World War. In a literal sense, we, unlike Binion or our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents, cannot remember them. For the Commission, that problem worsens with each passing year, given that its remit ends in 1947. We can honour and memorialise them, but where those whom we remember died in the Falklands or in Iraq or Afghanistan, and the Commission has no responsibility for them. The principle of no repatriation was breached in 1982. Bodies of those killed in action are returned to their families, and there is no principle of equality and no national undertaking to care for their graves in perpetuity. That is the obligation laid on the Commission for the graves of the dead of those since the two World Wars. Although the Commission was not as ready for the First World War centenary as it should have been in 2006, since about 2011, it has undergone a series of quiet revolutions which began to fit it for a new century and for a public which could not, in fact, remember. It appointed historians and archivists. When the Commission today faces calls to recognise so-called non-commemorations, it is doing so precisely because of the past failure to address its history or to use its archives as anything other than a working archive rather than a historical resource. The Commission convinced itself that because the first Kenyan principle was equality in death, regardless of race, that principle must have been observed with consistency. We now know it was not. The Commission has also realised that it needs to educate its visitors who, unlike those first pilgrims to the front in the 1920s, did not necessarily know why those buried there had died. It came to accept that it might have to rethink its horticultural standards in the light of climate change, as again, Baroness Goldie has mentioned. It embraced the readiness of volunteers to assist in the conservation and promotion of their sites. Rejected then, or before then, because they were incapable of sustaining those volunteers, the high standards which the Commission demanded of its own staff, the gardeners and stonemasons marked by long service, frequently over successive generations. The Commission has moved a long way, not least because it is now ready to face challenges and even relish them, not to work against them. In 2023, those challenges are acute, and I would like to devote the rest of my words to highlighting 6 of them. Many of them flow directly from the Kenyan principles to this day, because clear rules make for hard cases. The first is so far outside the Commission's remit that it will never address it, but it's worth making the point that the Commission commemorates only the military dead of the 2 World Wars and not the civilian dead, even when civilians were killed by enemy action, whether the German bombardments of 1914 or the air raids of the Second World War. We don't actually know how many British or Imperial civilian dead there are from the 2 World Wars. But even if we did, the scale of the task will be beyond any institution to embrace. But that can look odd to many observers from the outside, who, particularly with the wars going on in Israel and Ukraine, recognize the role of national mobilization in how modern war is fought. And there is a further problem too, because, as I've already said, hard rules make hard cases. And when we worry about the status of African laborers, porters, Indian laborers, and British laborers for that matter, in the armed forces employ, one of the reasons we have difficulty is not just the failure to address the historical record, but also the uncertainty as to whether they were employed as civilians or whether they were enrolled in military capacities. Who was a civilian and who was military is obscured, for example, by the Merchant Navy Memorial on Tower Hill. Why should merchant sailors be commemorated, but laborers or porters not? Both were civilians in both categories, both faced exposure to death, and both, of course, suffered as a consequence of the war. The second point is that the Commission was set up in very different geopolitical conditions. In 1919, the British Empire stood at its greatest ever geographical extent. Many of the Commission's cemeteries were located in areas that fell within that empire. And the biggest concentration of cemeteries outside the empire lay, as it still does today, in France and Belgium, two countries which were so grateful for Britain's contribution to their defense that they were ready to hand over the land, and large tracts of it, of course, on which British casualties had been buried and where cemeteries were constructed, to use that phrase, in perpetuity. Therefore, with one significant exception, and that significant exception was Turkey, the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923 under the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne, or its recognition, included specific provision for the Commission's care of its cemeteries within areas of the former Ottoman Empire. With that significant exception, all the original sites of the Commission lay in lands that either belonged to the British Empire or to its allies, and therefore were effectively under British control. Since 1945, the number of states in the world, not least thanks to decolonization, has tripled. And today the Commission maintains, as Peter Hudson's already observed, cemeteries in over 150 of them. That's roughly 3/4 of the countries of the world. Not all those countries welcome a British presence in the ways in which our predecessors largely took for granted. And even if the staff managed them in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, including in Gaza, which regularly figured in my time when we deliberated the care of cemeteries because they had suffered damage, even if they carry on maintaining those cemeteries to very high standards, there is a problem for visitors in getting to them. Is it sustainable for the Commission to remain in all the countries in which it currently finds itself? The third point, the Commission's original title made clear that it was created as an imperial organization. That was very close to Ware's heart when he drove the formation of the Commission. It was centered on the United Kingdom and the 4 so-called white dominions of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and of course, India. For today's South Africa, the 2 world wars are largely a legacy of white rule and ultimately of apartheid. For India too, for all its massive manpower contribution to the imperial war effort, there are issues. Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka are now independent states, and the legacy of the British Indian Army is problematic for the Modi government, if not for the Indian Army itself. The Commission cares for the graves of the colonial forces, but unlike the dominions, those colonies had, beg your pardon, had no representation in the Commission's governance. Today, they are largely, almost entirely, independent states within the Commonwealth, pursuing their own foreign policies and potentially engaging in their own wars. They still have no role in the governance of the Commission, and that means that unlike the 6 original members, they also have none of the costs, fully for them. Is such an arrangement politically an enormous... is such an arrangement politically and economically sustainable? Fourth point, those costs are rising, like everybody's costs. Lutyens did not plan his memorials any more than his buildings, with an eye to their long-term maintenance. The gardens were not laid out or planned with an eye to climate change. The legal requirements of operating under many jurisdictions can make the business of land ownership, maintenance, and insurance deeply differentiated as well as highly expensive. Fifth point, over 300,000 of the commissioned burials are here in the United Kingdom, but in sites that are even more starkly differentiated than those overseas. Remember that repatriation was still possible in 1914-15. Remember too that many of the wounded from European theatres in both world wars died here at home in hospitals. And of course, that many of those who served specifically in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force were commemorated within these islands rather than overseas. In 1921, the Commission took on responsibility for the care of those buried in the United Kingdom, but they did not take on responsibility for the headstones, some of which are remarkably elaborate, but many of which are today neglected. It has become easier, moreover, to gain recognition for the graves of those who may have died as a result of war wounds. There has been, in my observation, an increasing tolerance in terms of deciding whether or not somebody should genuinely count as a war casualty. The standards used to be set very high, and now, I think for good reasons, they have become more relaxed. The result is that the numbers of UK commemorations are still being added to. But in some parts of the United Kingdom, some of the dead are also being lost. Most are located in cemeteries run by local authorities or in private hands. The former especially no longer have the resources to maintain the cemeteries in their care, and in some cases, they can no longer be safely accessed. The practice of taking down headstones, which are themselves no longer safe, extends to war graves, especially when they are private memorials over which the Commission has no rights and which are not marked by Commission headstones. Sixth problem, the science of the recovery of bodies and the identification of those bodies has been transformed since 1918. And the pressures of time and scale, which operated in the aftermath of both world wars in terms of collecting the dead and burying them and erecting memorials, have of course diminished. Forensic skills, thanks not least to improved procedures in criminal cases, have been transformed. And now there is the possibility of DNA identification. Between 2003, so 20 years ago, and 2008, a combination of archival work and archaeological digging, driven by Australia, exposed a mass grave of mostly Australians, but a few British, at Fromelles, a battle fought in 1916 in the opening stages of the Somme. The Commission was sceptical about the possibility both of full recovery and of successful identification. But in 2010, a new cemetery, Pheasant Wood, was opened at Fromelles, the first new Commission cemetery in 50 years. Of 250 bodies, 225 were identified as Australian. And of those, all but 59 were individually identified, many of them thanks to DNA testing. That was a staggeringly high success rate, achieved in part because it was easier to achieve it, given Australia's smaller population in the First World War, to identify, and specifically to identify close relatives. The two identifiable British bodies have not been identified. The Commission cannot exhume and identify those soldiers known unto God, whose bodies it has in its care. The scale of the task is just beyond human imagination. And it is also, of course, beyond, will go way beyond what the Commission could afford, as well as being totally impracticable. The conditions which enabled such success as was achieved at Fromelles are unlikely to be replicated in the vast majority of cases. But the implications, particularly when allied to public engagement and greater efforts by the Commission to educate, have opened a door of hope to some who seek to identify the missing, which it will always be hard to close. The Commission's strategy, which I commend to you for 23 to 2026, the first 3 years towards 2039, as it puts it, places diplomacy at its centre. It will need diplomacy, both literally, as it faces a much more complex international situation than its predecessors did 100 years ago, for all the challenges of ending the First World War, and metaphorically, as it speaks to a public with a set of expectations and sometimes a set of entitlements, every bit as great as those who opposed the Kenyan principles in the first place. Thank you very much.
And then touching in the end on the 6 challenges you see going forward. I'm Mark Urban, and I'm here to lead the discussion about the future of commemoration. I'm a BBC journalist, occasional military historian, and trustee of the Imperial War Museum. On the panel, obviously, we have Sir Hugh, we have Claire Horton, who is Director General of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. We have David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who has also campaigned for the rectification of the non-recognition of many of those buried in and around the Commonwealth War Graves sites. And we have Lieutenant General Benjamin Bathurst, a very distinguished soldier who is currently the UK military representative to NATO and the EU, it says, so to both of those international organizations. As I said, our mission is to look at the future. And when Peter Hudson was talking about the Commonwealth War Graves sites in 1,000 years' time, I found that quite sobering. I thought to myself, well, if any of my progeny are doing something more than powering the server farms that will locate the AI that rules their lives in 1,000 years' time, then I think that's quite an optimistic outlook. But let's try and look at the next 10, 15 years, the next government or two, in terms of trying to sort of map out what people feel should be the future of commemoration, and indeed whether it's attainable. I'm going to go straight to Claire, because Hugh, obviously, we've heard his views about the challenges ahead. Let's go to Claire, and if we could get a quick overview from you about how you see the future going forward and what the challenges might be from your perspective.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. And thank you to the departing Baroness Goldie. Wise words and important words. And thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. And thank you also particularly to Hugh, because I think what both of them have done is really spell out a lot of the detail of the history of the Commission, but also the detail of the challenges that we face today. I'm relatively new. I'm just almost 3 years into my role as Director General of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, a very privileged position indeed, and one I take very seriously. I am not the military historian, and I'm not an expert on conservation, but I am very much a visionary, an optimist, and someone who cares very passionately about doing the right thing for our fallen, for remembering them in perpetuity, and for ensuring that future generations, particularly as those world wars disappear in living memory, that future generations really do understand the human cost of war and the freedoms that we all owe to the people that we commemorate through not just the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but other war graves associations around the world. And I am delighted to welcome colleagues from other associations in the room today, and I do hope you'll get a chance to talk to them. So when starting at the Commission, my big consideration was, well, what does the future look like? How do we remain relevant way into the future? I'm not quite sure, like you, Mark, what 1,000 years from now is going to look like. But certainly what we're looking towards now is ensuring by the time that we get to 2039, that beginning of the anniversaries of the Second World War, is that we have an organization that is ready, fit, and running well, that it is looking after all of those sites, that the horticulture is sustainable, is in tune with the world as we will see it, as we are seeing it change, so that those beautiful places that people know us by and come from all around the world to visit in 153 countries, 23,000 sites, that those beautiful places are as accessible as they can be. And we heard how difficult that is in some parts of the world. But that do never forget and never lose the specialness of their purpose, and that the remembrance of the people that are remembered and buried there. But what does that mean? That means we have to be different, we have to be better, we have to be clever, we have to be far-sighted. We have to understand what climate change means to the management of an aging estate, how increasing extreme weather events are going to affect the structures, the facilities, even the graves that we have, and we lose them constantly, and we see damage with extreme weather. So how do we make sure we plan for that? Do we stay in all of the places that we are now? And I'm not quite sure how we would pull back from that, or whether we would want to, but it is a question I think we'd be interested in hearing about today. How we bring the Commission, the work, the loss, the human cost of war, and the cost of the world wars to future generations. Because both Baroness Goldie and Hugh talked about how too many people don't know what we do, why we are who we are, and what those cemeteries really are about. And often we will get asked, are there actually people under those headstones? Well, there are. We have 1.1 million headstones around the world, and that's 1.1 million people under there. And we, of course, have everyone else looked after on memorials, those beautiful structures, those monuments that need to be looked after. How do we manage the cost? How do we deal with rampant inflation? How do we get enough sufficient funds? We are funded by 6 Commonwealth governments, and I'm grateful that almost all of them are here today. Thank you so much for your continued support. And we look after our Commonwealth fallen on behalf of them. But where does that money go, particularly in times of economic crisis? The geopolitical dynamics, particularly as war has now returned to the European continent, and of course the increasing and awful events that we're now seeing in Gaza and Israel. How do we continue in those circumstances? How do we manage those? But what does the future look like? So what is the future cemetery of 50 years, 100 years like? How do we use digital technology? Is there alternative commemorations in places perhaps where we can't get? How do we make sure that those people there are never forgotten? How do we make sure they're accessible to their families, their descendants and others? And how do we make sure that the children of today become the commemorators, the rememberers of tomorrow? People who will take forward these messages of peace, bring people of different nations together. And all of these, and I think through all of our sites and the work that we do, help us become, I hope, an agent of diplomacy, an actor people can call on for other things. And with a presence in so many countries and relationships with so many governments and so many communities, I think we can play our part to ensure that remembrance is in perpetuity.
Thank you so much. David Lemmy, I clearly value hearing your views about the future of commemoration, but I wonder if you could also address the campaign you launched to commemorate those who in some senses were forgotten or unmarked, and how you feel that's going as part of that future vision.
Thank you very much. And let me just say that I'm very conscious that this weekend, members of Parliament, all of us, will be standing on Sunday morning at our war memorials. It's an event that MPs do not miss in their calendars. There are a handful of things that you do every year, And believe me, you're pretty nervous if you can't make that Sunday morning. And it's cross-party, of course. We will be there. And for me in Tottenham, I'm very conscious, it's very moving, because obviously it's a thoroughly multicultural affair that brings communities together, all of them reflecting on war and many of them thinking back to family members, because for me it's the wider Commonwealth who lost their lives, particularly in the Second World War. And I'm thinking also all of this will be about the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel, Gaza this year. And it occurred to me that as challenging as it is this year, particularly because of the bloodshed and loss of life in Israel, Gaza, that I suspect that some of the emotion is in part because of the huge success of commemoration. That is that in our country, generations of young people understand the horrors of war, even if they themselves have not lived through it. And that is something to do with commemoration. And therefore, when people see bombs falling and civilians dying, in a way, the whole point of commemorating, as painful and hard as it is a testament to those who said that we must never, ever forget. I think too that the age that we're in, two elements of that, the social media age, the fact that everything is filmed, the horrors are filmed and are flying around social media, is in part deeply traumatic for people. Deeply, deeply traumatic. And that's something I think we've got to continue to reflect on and have views on, and government probably has to have views on as we seek to regulate, if you like, people's exposure to what in the end is post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, of course, our television screens. You know, many of us would have grown up in an era where there was a watershed, where there was very careful handling of what people could view and sensibility. And those standards have moved, haven't they? So people are exposed to something that they may not have been exposed to before. But I suppose the other thing I reflected on, and I'm very grateful to Channel 4, to David Olusoga, to Michelle Barrett, Professor Michelle Barrett, and the work that was done on non-commemoration and those that had been forgotten. I'm very conscious that the Second World War that I learned about, and that I think is still the case for young people, successive generations now of young people growing up in our country, was really all entirely about the Western Front. Sorry, that's the First World War, forgive me. It was about the poems of Wilfred Owen, Flanders Field. It was never, ever, I didn't even know really that there was an Eastern Front. No one told me, or I suspect most of you, that the first shots were fired not in Europe, but in Africa. And so it was a revelation, really, when I was asked to do this documentary and really get into it. It was a revelation to understand the role of the King's riflemen, African riflemen, and the carrier corps. I knew nothing about it. And so there's a tremendous job to do, I think, that clearly the Commonwealth War Graves Commission could not possibly do on its own, and is not really of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. But there's a big job, I think, for departments of education working with schools to do far better as we come to understand these histories in a different way than we have done previously. And I worry that we're a little slow, frankly, on telling the entire story, the entire picture that gets us to a better place. I think the second thing that I picked up, and I was very privileged to go with Claire, David McDonald and others to Kenya earlier in the year. Was it earlier in the year or last year? I think.
No, it was earlier this year. It flies by.
April this year, to see the work that's going on as a result of that revelation. And I was really pleased, notwithstanding the pandemic and the speed at which people could move. I was really pleased to see that work happening, certainly in Kenya, and the way in which it was cherished and held by African staff at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I'm thinking of a wonderful man called Patrick, particularly, so dear, because they had their stories. And what they said to me was, for us, and this had not occurred to me, for us, our relatives were lost. They were taken. They were kidnapped. We did not know what happened to them. And so for us, this story of the Carrier Corps is a reveal. It's bringing them back into sharp focus. And they cherish so much unpicking the stories and revealing this. I spent time in the university, both for doing the documentary and in going in April. Again, young people there in situ saying, we do not know this history. We want to know this history. We want to own this history. Again, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cannot do all of that work. So how do you work with departments of education and others to make this not just something that's owned by those who commemorate, but owned by an establishment who educate? Because I think that is so very, very important indeed. And then I think reflecting on young people, both in our own country and beyond, reflecting on the trauma of war, and we are experiencing that now at this point in time. I think that the role of commemoration in the 21st century has got to remain central. I think it's hugely valued, but I think that as we use digital archives, technology and others, it's the partnership working beyond commemoration, particularly with those who educate and those who are in the establishment of forging histories, academics particularly, how we reach wider audiences and tell stories that feel as relevant in the 21st century as the stories that we told in the 20th.
Thank you, David.
General Barfus, the soldier's perspective.
Thank you. I think what commemoration means for me is that it really reflects who we are as a country. But in my role as military representative to NATO, I would add as an alliance as well. And of course, what has happened over the years, some people we fought with, we are still allies, and some we are not. And it helps transcend those boundaries, and as has been mentioned, also a vehicle for reconciliation. I think it's really important that we are not afraid to acknowledge the past, and that we can separate out the deeds of individuals from the wider political context. Many, of course, who served didn't want to join up, but they did, or maybe they had to. And I think what commemoration allows us to do for the fallen is reflect the gaps that they left in their family, lives that were cut short. And in doing so, we can actually reflect for those who've survived, and really for everyone, reflect on their own lives and how they can appreciate, how we can all appreciate the freedom, including to protest, and how we can live the best lives that we can that others are not able to. I think the other thing is whether you're serving or veterans or families, emotions that are often buried through the year, they come out at times of remembrance. I think it reminds us to look after those who are left behind in their families, particularly those suffering from wounds who cannot be seen. So it's really important for all men and women who are serving or intend to serve to know that they will be honoured. And I think one can reflect of the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, of which I'm the Army Commissioner, having taken over from General Sir Bill Rollo earlier, that we know that we will be honoured in death, and that our families know that that is the case. And I think, as Sir Hugh Strawn said, particularly important, and even more important today, almost, the Kenyan principles and how they transcend the decades of equality, irrespective of background. So in terms of the scope of commemoration, I think it is a unifier. When the Chief of Defence Staff went to Russia 4 months before the further invasion of Ukraine, the first thing he did with his counterpart, General Gerasimov, was to lay a wreath for those who served in the Arctic convoys and fell in World War II. That was a unifying experience. I think, as we mentioned, the role of digital capability, fantastic work of the Imperial War Museum, of the National Archives, of such organisations such as the Imperial War Museum. If you can connect the graves or the names on memorials with the history, I think that will really help widen the reach. The sustainability is really important, eradicating the use of pesticide, reducing water, effects of climate change. And I defy anyone to visit Bedford Farm in Flanders and not be impressed by the composting operation that goes on there. I come from a long line on my mother's side of gardeners, but the genes ended there. But I was very impressed knowing whether one's compost is aerobic or anaerobic. So in terms of the future, funding is, of course, the challenge. I think others can assist, but a government does not honour the fallen will find it very difficult to recruit and retain. And then finally, as David Lammy has very eloquently expressed, the link between commemoration and those who fought with us, whether willingly or with encouragement and less willing, that is really, really important. And therefore, I would sum it up as honour the individuals, learn from the past.
Thank you, Ben. I think your reminder about those who serve now and the importance of commemoration to them was particularly apposite. Let's come back to Sir Hugh Strawn. You isolated 6 challenges. I'm quite interested in a sense in the ones where several of your factors come together. Geography, conflict. I mean, through the job I have, I managed to get into Commonwealth War Grave sites in Basra and in Gaza and in Libya. Now, in all of those, visiting is obviously extremely difficult. In the Basra case, even maintaining the site has become near impossible. Should that influence the question, should it arise, of retrenchment and which sites would not be sustainable?
That's no longer a responsibility I have, thank goodness, as I'm no longer a commissioner. And as Claire has also done the question, I think I won't doubt. What I would say, I think the real challenge is how permanent are the conditions which make sites inaccessible and how recurrent are the problems that sites present. So if you were judging this from the perspective of 1939, the Commission had just about completed all its work in France and Flanders. The Vimy Memorial had just been completed by Canada. And the next thing that happened, of course, was all this fell under German occupation. And it might have been expected that the Germans would tear most of this down. And they did tear down one particularly offensive Australian Divisional Memorial because it showed a digger doing violence to a symbol of Germany. But the rest they left. And Hitler actually, from memory, gave that guarantee that, particularly to Canadians, the Vimy Memorial specifically would be respected. But the point here is that actually, in that case, the damage that occurred in northwestern Europe was the direct result of combat more than it was a result of a government intent. And of course, as we know, not only did it become that a renewed site of combat, but also it was restored fully to the Commission after 1945. So as you look at situations, for example, the areas of difficulty, and you've mentioned, I mean, the whole, across the swathe of North Africa, particularly Algeria, Libya, real problems. You look at self-evidently at Gaza, and you look at areas, Gaza, of course, recurrent concern for us when I was a commissioner. All those are real areas of problem. The Commissioner's desire to look at these things in perpetuity. So does that mean a problem that runs for a century is a short-term issue? Or does it mean that it's a long-term issue? And I think that is the challenge that confronts the Commission. It seems to me that the Gaza problem is now sufficient for the current. The repairs that have had to be done over recent years, and the fact that almost certainly there will be French damage as a result of what's going on now, mean that there is a real issue there. On the other hand, Gaza is part of a wider network of cemeteries that for Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, and the Indian Army represent the Palestine campaign of the First World War. And for that, on that basis, there is an integrity there to the sites, which doesn't put Gaza simply in isolation. Beersheba is part of it. And of course, going north through what is today Israel into Lebanon is also part of the site. So it's going to be a case-by-case response to that. But I think the real big case for saying what we're really saying, and I think what Claire's saying, is that the assumption that because the Commission's been there, it's always there. Because people are buried there, they should remain there, is actually no longer simply axiomatic. And we already recognize this in case of individuals' graves in difficult locations, the need to concentrate burials. After 1945, that principle of concentration was taken much further than after 1918, making sites more manageable and creating mass cemeteries. So I'm not giving a straight answer to a straight question because there isn't a straight answer.
But it's complex. Yeah. I'd love to welcome His Excellency Vikram Doraiswamy, the Indian High Commissioner, to the panel. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We asked each of the panelists at the outset to give their view about the future of commemoration of the war dead. And it would be great if you could give us your thoughts on what you think the future should be and what the challenges might be to keeping that commemoration going.
Thank you very much. And my apologies at the outset for having been caught up with something else. I have my primary boss, my minister, coming in a couple of days' time. So we are a little caught up right now. But I think I wanted to sort of do the diplomatic thing in a sense, position a couple of questions to that question. First of all, I think, as you very eloquently said, sir, the question of permanence is something we have to interrogate. After all, conflict has been part of the human condition for millennia. We know of it in our history, in our civilization. You know of it in East Asia, you know of it across Europe. So what is it that we do that makes certain conflicts more, how should I put it, more amenable to the idea of permanence? I would suggest here that the main challenge or the main driver of the need to look for permanence is the fact that conflict increasingly over the centuries has become universal. In a sense, when wars took place earlier, it was a certain professional class of soldiery who went out. You know, you had feudal levies that were raised, you had a certain set of standing armies. you had people who were called up to fight. But today, conflict literally is universal. In other words, in a society, everybody gets embroiled in conflict. So there is therefore a greater need after the conflict for people to see commemoration of the dead and reconciliation as connected pieces. So I think permanence of sites needs to be linked to the idea of larger reconciliation. And making it relevant in that sense, I think, is a critical part of ensuring permanence. How can we do that? So here's one thought. When you look at how in the 50th anniversary of the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, it was very powerful, I think, that countries got together at the highest level to actually commemorate at one of the major grave sites in France, the idea of never again. And this included, leaders of countries that were originally on opposite sides of the war. So too at grave sites in India, Commonwealth grave sites in India, for instance, in Kohima, which is the eastern end of the Eastern War. There are now commemorative events that bring together soldiers or representatives of governments from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, India, and of course, Japan, as former representatives of former foes, to give that sense of these sites being relevant for reconciliation. There's a second part to it, which is if we are sincere about the idea of seeing conflict as something that is the most extreme means by which states regulate state-to-state behavior, and therefore an exception, you need to make conflict and the outcomes of conflict, the human outcomes of conflict, relevant to subsequent generations. So how do we do that? If you see increasingly, in the last 50 years at least, as long as I can remember certainly, popular culture's treatment of conflict has also changed. You only need to look at, I don't know if I'm definitely betraying my age, but I suspect there are a few at least my age, Commando comics, for instance, which had a particularly, shall we say, colorful approach, even though they were black and white, to conflict, right? I mean, your average Tommy's biceps were bigger than Bournemouth. And the general sort of German or Japanese soldier was almost caricature and villainy. That has changed broadly to a much more sympathetic portrayal or a much more gray portrayal of conflict. Saving Private Ryan, if you look at that as an exemplar of how popular culture can de-glamorize conflict. I think it's really important to get multiple cultures involved with that. This is to say, for instance, in Kenya, where you have war graves, or in India, where you have war graves, or in Middle East. It seems to me a very good idea to be able to try and make these sites relevant to young people there. Because otherwise, if it's not, then it's just this exotic little piece of gardens with gravestones there. And it really does need to be taken out of the exotic and made part of the everyday. In India, one of the big challenges is the fact that 73,000 Indian soldiers are buried in Commonwealth war graves from World War I, and another 80,000 from World War II. And God knows how many, fell without name, so to speak. How do you make that a story relevant to people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today by utilizing popular culture? And that, again, is not being told. We either have outstanding pictorial books or excellent grave sites, but these don't connect with popular culture. My friend and colleague, the author Shrabani Basu sitting here, has done some very interesting histories of Indian soldiers in World War I and II. I think there is a need now to make that more popular understanding. I'm sure many of you would not have had an opportunity, for instance, to visit this massive Commonwealth grave site in Burma, Myanmar, just outside Yangon. It's a massive site, and what I found a huge learning, despite having studied the history of this, the extent of names of people from what were then called the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, in West Africa. And they fought and died all the way over there in the Burma campaign. And there is no, to my mind, necessary reason why we can't connect people there in West Africa with this story. So really, to interrogate the question of permanence, you really have to understand, how do you make it permanent? In other words, how do you make it a story that applies or appeals to everybody else? And frankly, for me, I think reconciliation, popular culture, education, to David Lamy's excellent point about not knowing these stories. It is so important for all of us to know these stories, whether they are from sides of the conflict that we agree with today or disagree with today. It really is valuable, because the larger story of humankind's need for conflict and its recognition that our capacity through technology to inflict unimaginable levels of destruction needs to be curbed by the capacity to understand how do you reconcile and how do you use memory as a means of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I am not going to abuse Chair's privilege, and I'm aware that we've already eaten up a fair bit of our time, but I am going to ask one follow-up to David Lamy, picking up there on the Ambassador's point about education and people in school now. You know, the empire was the basis on which the armies were mobilized, and for example, the West African divisions fighting in Burma. Is empire, which in many ways is now seen as a toxic idea or a problematic idea by many younger people, a help or a hindrance in understanding sacrifice in the world wars and commemorating them?
Easy question. If I think back to February last year, I was crafting my response to the invasion of Ukraine. And obviously, for us here in the UK, our position on supporting Ukraine is a cross-party position. And in crafting that, I found myself writing and saying that I knew something of having ancestors who had to respond to the barrel of a gun. And it cannot be right in the 21st century that we do not stand up to Putin's imperial ambitions. So it is to say that the whole point of commemorating war and reflecting, and as history takes its place, you would expect over centuries and periods for people to cast a different perspective on war and on empire. Our understanding evolves and we learn from that history. It matters to me hugely that when I speak to young people, I tell them a story of the power and importance of standing up to fascism in Europe. And young people in our country reflect often on what would it have been like had Hitler won. And it is only in being able to answer that story that you are able to stand up to fascism today. And indeed, I found myself in the studio up against Trevor Phillips and Victoria Derbyshire a few weeks ago, saying, for me, there are two important things that arise from the Second World War that we should reflect on hard at this moment. One is the birth of Israel and a home for the Jewish people, consequence of the Holocaust. And the second is the importance of a rules-based order, that even war has rules And we must follow those rules, particularly when it comes to civilian casualties. So I suppose what I'm saying in answer to your question is I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's a black or white, yes or no thing. I think it's an evolving thing. I certainly think it's a mistake to sort of hide away from interrogations of Europe's colonial past. I think that's a mistake. You have to confront it and recognize that we are big enough for different perspectives on these shared histories.
Fabulous. Let's open it to the floor. Philip Dunn is the first person to catch my eye. I think a microphone is on its way to you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Philip Dunn. I'm a parliamentary commissioner. And I'd just like to start by thanking you, David, for what you said about the role that MPs play in their constituencies this coming weekend. I think that's very nice to hear that recognised. I'd also like to thank you for the work that you did with Channel 4 in bringing to the attention of the Commission this omission, this glaring omission of the uncommemorated. You were you spoke very powerfully about the need for education, which I think everybody will agree with. Could I ask you to mark the homework of the Commission in responding to that challenge which you posed, because you've had the opportunity to see some of the work that we're doing. It'd be really helpful to know what else you think that we need to do.
Very reluctant to mark homework. Claire and I get on incredibly well.
We do.
I was actually very moved by what I saw in Kenya. I was very moved, as I said, by Patrick and others and their dedication to what they were doing. And the staff of the Commission, who I thought were taking this very seriously. The response to the Channel 4 documentary initially was a little bit, what's the word? I think there was a state of shock. And I was really pleased that under Claire's leadership, the commissioners moved way beyond that. I think it probably would be right for the Commission to think about how it has some sort of 360 exercise independently that reviews that work to give people well beyond the Commission a sense of where they've got to, I think would be my suggestion, rather than me. But some independent focus that reflects on, I suspect, a job done, but more to do. I do think it's ongoing. I'm not sure that there is a sort of categorical end. I would say, and clearly, I was in Kenya. As you move on to Tanzania, Sierra Leone, down other countries, the work will be at different stages. But I do think it's been really good to work with local people, local historians on the ground, to find ways to give local communities ownership, to get beyond the myths, I think, of the early part of the 20th century, where it was assumed that African communities did not commemorate their dead. I mean, such a bizarre idea when you think about it now, but that was the assumption, and this idea of reverting back to nature and really allowing communities to own how they commemorate, I think is really, really important, because that will be slightly different in different jurisdictions. But I personally was very moved and very pleased to be able to do that trip with Claire back in April. It touched me greatly, and all power to the work that's currently going on.
Thank you. Robert Fox.
Well, from a serving commissioner to a former commissioner, I joined Hugh and the others for 6 years, covering the commemoration of the Great War, whence arises my 3 points or questions. They are questions. First, as he was talking about access, and you, Mark, to these very difficult sites, how much further consideration is there, to the awful word I know, to virtual commemoration, virtual representation? It's a big thing. Second, which you've all raised and looked at, is history and heritage. Your predecessor, Victoria Wallace, pointed out that we were drifting away from actual memory. And can I just add, as a curious footnote, I went to the St. Carlos cemetery, where the War Graves Commission, it's not a War Graves Commission cemetery, but we have agency and we have the familiar headstones, where 4 or 5 years ago, I laid a wreath on the graves of people I'd actually known and been with in that battle, which is an extraordinary connection. Connections are receding, and this is the point about going, as Victoria put it, from history to heritage, which worries me, because the point about heritage is that there is inexorably a drift into sentimentality, from shock and awe, one might say, to schlock and awe, instead of looking at the reality, the history that you're working at so well with the archive, and Peter Francis has done so well with the media outreach, how important that is. And finally, the stinger is thinking of where we are today. You must be facing some not quite headwinds, but side winds from culture wars, from the culture wars that have arisen over commemoration, as we're seeing this week with the counter demonstrations. And how much are you seeing that as an issue in the future? Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Time is very tight, so I will direct 1 or 2 of those, if I may. General Ben, the point about history and heritage, moving beyond that generation of people with a direct connection, and of course the fact that the military, since the Falklands, has repatriated instead. Would you like to come back on Robert's question, which I guess is, how do you maintain that sense of connection?
Yes, I'm not sure I'm so well qualified to judge, because I think, as you know, Robert, within the military, we really treasure our history and heritage, and it's sort of part of our syllabus at Sandhurst and the other establishments. So I think perhaps the challenge for us is how do we export it to those who may be less interested. I think history is, and I think picking up on what David Lammy said, that everyone, in whichever nation they have been brought up with or have connections with, there's got to be a certain curiosity as to what it would have been had those individuals, whether they wanted to or not fought for that. And there are many fantastic success stories, a few that are less so. But I think it is making those linkages, and in doing so, I think it'd be quite difficult for most people not, if they look hard enough, to find some sort of connection with their family, but they perhaps just didn't know it. And I think that's the power of the digital age. That's going to become much easier in the future.
Thank you, Ben. Well, on the digital and Robert's point about virtual commemoration, Claire, do you think that, even with a heavy heart, is the direction that some sites could move in, particularly the ones that are geographically or because of conflict, very different places?
I think digital commemoration, alternative commemoration, is something we have to look very seriously at. But of course, you can't forget that there are tens of thousands of people buried and left on memorials in the countries that we're talking about. They still have families, and many, many thousands of those families will visit those often remote sites. And so we have to think about whatever we do very carefully and look at that over time. But I think how we use digital, particularly with a younger generation now, and everything is very much online is going to be really critical. So over here, you'll see Fall Forevermore, which is stories of the fallen. You can access our archives. This is about how you engage people with those stories of the past, how you relate back to those people who were lost, how you connect people potentially with their own history, their own families, their own communities that they didn't even know existed. And that's got to start, I think, with education. Starts in schools. We need to see more on the curriculum. We need to see this working better for young people. It's got to start with visiting to sites, be they very beautiful cemeteries, or be they something different. And just if I take you back to last week, where we were very privileged to host the King and Queen at Carrier Hall in Nairobi, which is currently it's a burial site, but it's actually quite an empty site in terms of headstones. And we are looking with that community, how we utilize that space differently, how we bring people in, how we bring women's groups and children, how make it a learning space, make it an alternative use site, whilst not losing the fact it is a place of history, of commemoration, and of great importance to that community, to those carriers and those labourers that fell, because that is going to be where we remember them. And so it's how you get people to connect with a space. We are losing those last World War II veterans. They're not far away gone. And actually, so what do we do about children and handing over that torch of commemoration? Well, we're looking at that for Normandy next year, Normandy 80, how we, children of the world, can take forward that torch of commemoration from those veterans. There is something about connecting those two groups of individuals to take forward and to create history and to make sure that we remain relevant in the work that we're doing and remembering these people.
Thank you, Claire. We have time for just, well, if we take both of your questions, you were just one question. Okay, let's take this. I think it's probably the last question, but let's see how we go.
For my sins, I'm the Western Front Association branch chairman, so we do try and educate people with our meetings about First World War. My question, because my great-great-uncle was buried he was one of those casualties at Mons, buried in what was a German cemetery, became Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery with German bodies. So can you tell us something about the liaison between the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and other national and commemoration bodies, like the German one, for example?
Sorry, did you want to add on another question? Yeah, one other question. So the first one is liaison, which I think is one for Claire to pick up.
It's a very quick question, sir. I'm a geopolitical recent graduate student. My question is to everybody right now is, do you really think, regards to safeguarding the future, do you really think that two-state solution is the answer to the ongoing war in between Israel and Palestine? Because we stand for humanity. We don't want to be siding with the either. We just want this to stop. We are in 2023, a couple of decades past World War I and II. So do you think giving what each side wants and using highest level of diplomacy and negotiation to stop this, and we just don't, we are not yet ready to commemorate the barriers, the fallen? Could you please answer this question?
All right, so Claire, on the point about liaison with the other
absolutely. And it's a really quick answer from me, actually, because you can ask my colleagues themselves. We have the chief executives of our German partners running after German war graves. We have chief executive of our Australian colleagues. We have chief executive of the Americans over here, the Canadians over here, the French. So they're all in the room. And so we're all great mates.
One last question. Sir, is there a mic? Yeah.
Yeah, Andy Allen, ex-soldier. I was very fortunate that a couple of weekends ago, I took part in a British West India Regiment's Heritage Trust visit to Listenhook and to Poperinghe, commemorating those from the Commonwealth, namely from the Caribbean, who fell. And I thank the War Graves Commission for marking out the graves of people like Roy Manley, who was the brother of Norman Manley, and indeed 21 other British West Indian soldiers. My question is education on those Caribbeans now currently serving, or indeed in the future having the link to joining the British Army and the rich heritage, do you think we're doing enough to link what sacrifices were made in the past to those of the youngsters of the future to actually join Her Majesty's forces?
Okay, I'm going to ask somebody to answer that in a moment. Does anyone want to do the two-state solution?
Well,
it's still the answer.
It's not a direct answer, but I think what you highlight is an incredibly important problem as we confront memory, which is that the conversation so far has been about remembrance being good. And what we know of the conflict in the Middle East is that remembrance is deeply toxic. And that is a challenge. And there are those who've written on memory who don't see it as an opportunity for reconciliation, but as the opportunity for stoking animosity. That, I think, is something we too easily forget. And I've witnessed it and visited cemeteries myself, and I think that it's not a solution to the problem. Cemeteries can become a solution to the problem, self-evidently, but it's not axiomatic.
And lastly, last word from General Barthurst, which is on the making the link between those contributions, for example, West Indian.
I mean, and just to add on the first one, that I think, all campaigns should be fought with not solely the military instrument of power, and that's how they tend to be resolved as well, not to see things purely through a military lens. And in terms of the community, my previous job was General Officer Commanding London District. We did a significant amount of outreach across 32 boroughs in London, and quite often that took a lens of those who fought alongside us in the war, and the connection. I mean, the fantastic acts of bravery by the Sikh community, and using history as a way to connect, and making actually the British Army, which has been an imperial army, and actually, of course, we do recruit from the Commonwealth as well, and how that all makes up both our history and up to the present day, where we're an organisation that includes all.
Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to thank the panel on behalf of all this absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm very mindful of the time and that we are 3 minutes over, and I see our next speaker in the audience, but I hope you'll join me in giving the panel a round of applause. We'd like to call now on our next speaker, who is Matt Keogh, who is the Australian Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. Matt, welcome. The floor is yours.
I don't know.
You can all stay there. You can all stay there. Depends if you're going to pull funny faces while I speak or not. As long as you don't pull funny faces, that's fine. Well, thank you, everybody, for inviting me to join you here today. And I'd like to thank the Royal United Services Institute for hosting this really unique event. And I want to acknowledge the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in particular. Australia is proud to be a founding member of the Commission, and I recognise the more than a century's worth of work that you've done undertaking to honour the memory of the personnel of the Commonwealth who lost their lives during the First and Second World Wars. In a few days, we will all pause to observe Remembrance Day. It's a moment of solemn reflection as we remember those who lost their lives during the First World War and all wars and conflicts that have followed. This year marks the 105th anniversary of the armistice that brought an end to fighting on the Western Front. And even though more than a century has passed, we still gather, we still pause, we still remember. Some people may ask why. In Australia, honouring our veterans' war service is deeply entwined with who we are as a nation. The Anzac legend has helped shape our national identity. While the Anzac campaign ended in military defeat and retreat, the conduct of our Aussie diggers during this campaign and those that followed it have come to represent the values that speak to our national character. Writing of the Australian evacuation from Gallipoli, Historian Charles Bean captured the essence of the Anzac. Anzac stood and still stands for reckless valour in a good cause, for enterprise, resourcefulness, fidelity, comradeship, and endurance that will never own defeat. And in part, this is why 100 years on, we still commemorate and remember the service of those who have long since passed. It's about honouring the sacrifice that more than 103,000 Australians have made in service to our country. But it's not just about commemorating those long dead, or indeed those that have lost their lives for our nation since. Rather, on Anzac Day and Remembrance Day in 2023, we pay tribute to all those that have pulled on our uniform or uniforms to serve in war, conflict, and peacekeeping operations. We also pay tribute to their families, who have each made unique sacrifice in supporting a defence member. We must say thank you. We must make it known that we hold our defence personnel, veterans, and families in the highest regard. We are a grateful nation, I'm sure we are all grateful nations, for what they have done. And we are also grateful for what we ask our personnel to do now and what we may ask of them in the future. It is incumbent on us to commemorate all of this service. In Australia, commemoration actually has multiple purposes. As I said, it is a way to honour the service and sacrifice of all those who have worn our nation's uniform in times of war and in peace. It is also a way for families and friends to learn about the experiences of their loved ones. It is a way to pass down our traditions and stories to the next generation. Telling stories, participating in rituals, just as our Indigenous Australians record family and community histories. In Australia, our commemorations are never about the glorification of war, nor are they a celebration of the victor over the vanquished. Indeed, in many respects, they are about a shared humanity. They recognise the self-sacrifices of the past and serve as lessons for the future. Proper recognition and respect for our service personnel is also important in contributing to their overall well-being. While for a few, it can be easy to cast war as some nihilistic endeavour, for those who have served, who risk their physical and mental well-being, and for the families who support them, it's important to find meaning in their service. While for many the meaning is clear and obvious, we cannot and should not take this for granted. Finding meaning in our lives contributes to our sense of purpose and well-being. Many who choose to serve want to be part of something bigger. They want to give back to the nation. They want to stand up and defend the values we cherish. Those same values the Anzac spirit encapsulates: courage, integrity, endurance, the bonds of mateship, but also the nation's freedom, democracy, and justice. These are lofty ideals, often used as political catchphrases. But for our service personnel, they are not just closely held beliefs, but ideals that they quite literally fight to protect. It takes a remarkable person to decide to put themselves second to defend those values. That should be acknowledged, it should be respected, and it should be honoured. How we treat our veterans is a reflection of this. They certainly regard it that way. That includes not just the services and supports we provide to them, but in the way in which we commemorate their service and the service of their fallen comrades. Just this year in Australia, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. It is true that some veterans who returned home to Australia felt appreciated, but many felt unrecognised and unsupported by the nation that they had served. Today, we have a greater understanding of the role genuine recognition and support plays to instil meaning and pride in one's service and to support those in our Defence Force. Over the years, Australia has taken steps to improve recognition for the Vietnam veteran community, a process that was for some time incomplete. Yet this work remains ongoing and vitally important. It began with the Vietnam veteran community itself, with the first setting up of a volunteer-run counselling service to help their mates out. Now, the government-operated Open Arms Veterans and Family Counselling Service. Then they came together to commemorate Long Tan Day, one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War for Australia, where so many lost mates. Long Tan Day became Vietnam Veterans Day, a day chosen by those veterans to remember their mates. A day of healing and commemoration chosen by them, and now culminating in a day of commemoration where all Australians had the chance to offer a heartfelt thank you this year. A large part of what made that day successful came through engaging with and listening to the community, including their families. And it is important that we include the family experience because service impacts many more than just those serving, such as young children who never knew a parent because they never returned home. Others came back drastically changed as a result of their service. Families were critical in helping them deal with what they had been through and were themselves affected by that. This is true of all conflicts. So to have meaning, our commemorations need to reflect those experiences. Looking to the future of how we hold commemorations, this should be kept in mind. We need to remain engaged with the veteran community, current and former serving personnel, as well as families, to ensure we continue to reflect and appropriately honour their experiences and tell their stories in a way they desire. It is also no secret that Australia, like many comparable nations, are currently encountering recruitment challenges into our respective defence forces. There are many and complex reasons for this. More obviously, we need to ensure we provide veterans the support and services that they need and deserve. Putting to one side the inherent good of this for a moment, when there is a constant chorus that government is not providing what veterans need, it is of course also a disincentive to service. In Australia, we currently have a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide underway. It is necessary, and this work is extremely important. However, a negative side effect of the increased attention on these matters has been the false impression that all veterans are broken. The truth is that the very opposite is the case. The statistics tell us the vast majority of those who serve in Australia's Defence Force go on to have successful lives and careers when they transition to civilian life. Indeed, they outperform the general population. They are more likely to be employed, they earn more, they have a higher level of education, they are healthier and more likely to own their own home. The skills they gain through service, the attributes they possess, leadership, teamwork, agility, the ability to work under pressure, are the skills in demand in every organisation by every employer. Joining the Australian Defence Force sets up young people for success. They rightfully should be acknowledged as some of the best in the business, no matter the business. So when the narrative tells us that veterans are broken, we need to change the story. There are many ways to do this, but a significant part of it is commemoration. Commemoration that not only tells the stories of war and conflict, of the lives lost and families that mourn, but also that acknowledges triumph over adversity, valour, bravery and success. In this way, commemoration doesn't just speak to then, it speaks to now. It helps inspire, gives meaning and improves well-being. Commemoration done well and appropriately, accurately reflects why it's so important to be part of our Australian Defence Force now and into the future. To put it another way, commemoration plays not just an important role in recognising the service and sacrifice of our personnel, it acknowledges the contribution and support of their families, but it helps especially in relation to those that have been engaged in conflicts that may have been politically contested, to reinforce that no matter such disputes, we all come together as a nation, as nations, behind our Defence Force personnel who serve our nation. It sends an important message to those who may consider serving in the future that your nation honours, respects and thanks those who put on its uniform, not just now, but through the future. So commemoration, therefore, contributes to national identity and it contributes to service well-being. But we also shouldn't forget some of the stress and strain that commemoration can put on our veterans, as it does bring back the memories of those that have fallen, the conflicts that can still be so real for them in their day and in their nights as well. But in the act of remembering those who served and lost their lives in conflict, we also make a pledge to work for peace in our own time. There is no greater champion of peace than those lost silent witnesses of war. Through commemoration, it is our solemn duty to give those silent witnesses a voice. In Canberra, our Australian War Memorial commemorates some 103,000 people who lost their lives in Australia's name. Those are 103,000 stories, 103,000 people who never came home, all with families left to mourn. In Australia, we value and honour the service of our veterans. We tell their stories and we remember their sacrifice. And we want to do everything in our power to prevent that number from growing. Commemoration of war will always have a role to play in the cause for peace. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for reminding us that commemoration is not only about the past, but about the present. Sir Hugh did it's mentioned in jest that RUSI and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission are a perfect match. The more they change, the more they refurbish themselves, the more they look the same. I take it as a compliment. And it was intended as one. But I should point out how true this is. We've just reopened this refurbished institute that has been around for 200 years. And I'm grateful to the opposition spokesman for giving us so much of his own personal and party support. But one of the things we've done is, I'm not sure that you've noticed, at the entrance hall, the reception desk incorporates one of a perfect replica of a stone from one of the gravestones done by the same stonemasons of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and done in exactly the same style, as a silent tribute from the Institute, not only to those who have sacrificed themselves for this country, but also to the business of commemoration. So this is just the beginning of a much longer dialogue with you, which I hope we will conduct in the years to come. And as you've seen, it has gone well beyond the technical details of looking after cemeteries, as the minister reminded us, from the other side of the world, as it were, from this perspective. It is very much, the business of commemoration is very much about our own identity, which may be changing with time, as Sir Hugh pointed out, but it is very much also about our own ability to defend ourselves today. So I'm grateful to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and to everyone else who took part, who made this event possible. I think that some of you from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission will be meeting upstairs immediately thereafter, so I invite you there. I thank you all for taking part in this meeting, and above all, I thank all those who have contributed to the freedoms that allow us to meet today and to talk so freely. Thank you.